and welcome to the Bible for Worship on this Easter Sunday at St. Paul Lutheran Church, when our Easter Gospel is written in the Gospel according to St. Mark, chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" And when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there's the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. What an odd, abrupt ending to the Gospel. So odd and abrupt that indeed down through the centuries, starting very early in the tradition of the church, scribes and people with concern about how oddly this gospel ends added not one, but two other possible endings to this gospel, neither of which we read today because they reflect later, more developed concern to present the mission of the church in a particular light. Mark, apparently, writing right after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the early 70s for a community in Galilee, had no such concern. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. There's so much in these rich resurrection texts of the New Testament that preachers will make much of. Today, let's take a look at Mark's gospel in particular with a quick glance over to John at one point and ask a few interesting questions about the text itself and this odd, abrupt ending. We've said that Mark wrote right after the destruction of Jerusalem in the early 70s, and his community is now in Galilee. If you were with us last week for Mark's Palm Sunday Gospel in chapter 11, you know that Werner Kelber has suggested that part of Mark's concern is to reorient the congregation's expectation from a kingdom of David that was centered in Jerusalem to the kingdom of the Son of God that is centered in Galilee. Not because either one is better or worse than the other, not because the kingdom of David was somehow illegitimate or inadequate, simply because his community no longer had a temple in Jerusalem to join them together with others who worship the God of Israel and to be the focal point, as Acts tells us it was in the early church, the focal point for the early believers in Jesus who were in Jerusalem. And so here, is it possible that Mark tells this story and ends it so oddly and abruptly in order, again, to help his community understand what has happened to them? They have seen that great capital city of King David destroyed. They are now scattered to the north into the Galilee, seeking a future, wanting to know what comes next after that great destruction of the temple. And could there be a future here? And when Mark says that while the young man in the tomb told them that Jesus was going ahead to Galilee as he had said, why were there two generations of Christian leadership? Leadership by Peter and James, leadership of the community gathered around the name and the meal of Jesus. Why was that in Jerusalem for two generations? If already on Easter morning, the young man in glowing white robes had said, "Tell them Jesus goes before you to meet you in Galilee as he told you." Well, if the women are afraid and they say nothing to anyone, then the fact that Jesus would meet them in Galilee was not known to those first two generations. So of course they stayed in Jerusalem, the city of the great King David. There's nothing surprising about that if they don't know differently. But now Mark comes with his gospel and his resurrection account to say, indeed, already on that Easter morning, the young man knew and told the women, he goes before you to Galilee, where he will meet you as he told you. And there they are in the early 70s, Mark's community in Galilee. And they can anticipate that Jesus is meeting them there. Even so, with this explanation of why Mark might present his ending the way that he does, there's something in this ending that just begs the question, what will they do? And for the reader, what will you do? Here I want to take a quick look over at John's Gospel in John 20, verses 1 to 18. I won't read it. You can look it up if you choose. It's an alternate possible reading for any Easter day in the Revised Common Lectionary. In John 20, it is Jesus himself, the risen Lord, who meets Mary in the garden. At first, she doesn't recognize him, but when he speaks her name, of course, she knows that voice. She knows that relationship behind his saying, Mary. And Jesus says to Mary in John's Gospel, "Don't touch me. I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go and tell the disciples that I am ascending to my Father and your Father. I am ascending to my God and to your God." In both these accounts, in Gospels that are in some ways so very different in other respects, in both cases, Easter morning is not the end, but a beginning. It's not the culmination of something which we can now close the book, put it on the shelf, and rest satisfied, but rather, he goes before you to Galilee where he will meet you. I am going to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. And indeed, in John's Gospel, Jesus has said, I will draw all people to myself. There's some place to go from Easter morning. And where is that? There are a couple of hints. Notice that in both of these, it's on the first day of the week that the women come to the tomb. It's on the first day of the week that Jesus is raised. Now, in his predictions of his death and resurrection, he's talked about after 3 days I will rise. And in 1 Samuel 20, verse 12, we can see clearly that the third day is meant to be the day after tomorrow. It says, tomorrow I'll do this, and on the third day I'll do that. So if he dies on Friday, tomorrow is Saturday, the day after is the third day. Good enough. But in Hosea, chapter 6, verse 2, there is a passage in which the prophet says that God has afflicted us, God has chastened us, But on the second day, he will bind us up, and on the third day, he will raise us up. That second, third is a way that Hebrew has of talking about a general kind of time and putting those two phrases in parallel. But for the gospel writers, and already for Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, the tradition is there that when God has afflicted, it is on the third day that God rises. And so Paul passed on to his congregation what he had first received, that the Lord, having been crucified for our sins, was raised on the third day. And Mark knows in his passion predictions that he is raised on the third day. And the resurrection accounts are consistent in talking about the first day of the week that the women came. So the third day says, this is God's doing through and through. Have no doubt about that. It is God who raised Jesus on the third day, as people have known ever since Hosea. And the fact that it's the first day says, this is a new creation. And it was evening and it was morning, the first day. Remember that from Genesis 1? Here is a new creation. So where is it that Jesus leads the community? In Galilee and in his ascension, into that new creation. And what is it to which we're called? Well, the young man in white has announced that he is raised and goes before you. Rejoice in that victory over death and over every power that would keep you from God and God's love. Trust that the one who can raise Jesus from the dead can forgive our sins and raise us to newness of life. Have that faith in yourself that God has created through this mighty act. And then, as the young man says, go and tell and follow Jesus. God bless.